Okay, one of the hot topics in the Avatar community is Ozai as a villain. Was he good or was he not? Was he too flat? Was he just that really basic, oh, I'm a bad guy, I'm evil, I'm gonna kill everyone type of villain? So, right now, we're gonna answer the question, at least for us, our opinions, of whether or not we thought Ozai was a good villain.
Oh man, this is okay. When we say the word villain and good, it's very tough. What we mean by villain? Do we mean by antagonist? Do we mean just
Yeah,
an
like
obstacle
basically,
force?
when we think about villains, like people talk about how they like the Joker so much because he's just so crazy or random. They give reasons for liking villains, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, just think about all the villains you like. Is
So
Ozai one of them?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. So I think this is an interesting discussion, because I think that when you're talking about villains, there are different kinds of villains that serve different purposes, and so let me use Star Wars for an example. You have Darth Vader, who is the villain that we see, and then you have the Emperor, who's the villain that we don't see. And the villain that we see is like this embodiment of fear, but the villain we don't see is like he's the mystery. He's like the man behind the curtain, and he's the one who is essentially pushing forward the villain that we see. In Avatar, we have that same dynamic, and that dynamic is in a lot of different things. It's in like the Lord of the Rings. It's in like a bunch of different, you know, in a bunch of different stories. But in Avatar, we have that same dynamic working with Fire Lord Ozai and Azula, where Azula is the villain that we basically, and Zuko for like part of it, but like it
Yeah,
transitions
Zuko
to
for season one.
yeah, it transitions to Azula, where they are the villains that we see, and in the background behind all of it, like shrouded in mystery for most of the story, is Fire Lord Ozai, who we don't really ever see.
Yeah, until when Zuko returns, basically.
Exactly. And exactly. I think that once we see him, it's a little bit weird. I think that's kind of my thoughts on Fire Lord Ozai. Like there's some problems where we see him a little bit too soon. I feel like we see him too soon, or that we see too much of him, if that makes sense, too early on. Where it's like this mystery is kind of unraveled a little bit, and we've kind of seen behind the curtain a little bit too much. And I mean, it's not like a bad thing. It's just that I feel like Fire Lord Ozai in the first season is more of a
Scary.
menacing
Yeah.
force. Like he's scarier than the Fire Lord
Yeah, especially since all we got to
that we
see
see.
was like the vision
Yeah.
that Aang got when he was talking to Avatar Roku. Yeah, we just saw like Sozin's comment and then basically a silhouette of
Yeah, we only see like silhouettes.
yeah, we don't
and,
see his
like,
face basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's just
exactly.
him with some fire, and it's like, oh my gosh! As a kid watching that, you're just so scared. You're like,
Right.
wow, this guy's menacing.
Exactly.
First of all, in my opinion, I don't consider him a good villain. That being said, when we're talking about for an essential storytelling in terms of like what he's supposed to be, he's still a good essential villain. But what's interesting, what you brought up, OC, is this whole like him being the villain you don't see, and then by by them showing a little bit of him, like seeing that there's like a family and all that stuff, it kind of ruins that menacing factor. And it's ironic because in theory, what would actually make a good villain is by showing that. But because
Yes.
they establish a framework where it's
Right.
like he's supposed to be this thing you're supposed to be scared
Exactly.
of,
Exactly.
they kind of contradict the frame.
Exactly. It's the fact that him being one dimensional works when he's a mystery. But as soon as like he's not really a mystery anymore, the one dimensional aspect of who he is kind of becomes it gets in the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and an issue is that he ties into the characters way too much. Like Zuko and Azula, essentially, how they were raised and whatnot. You can't really see that unless you see what Ozai's up to. So, like, by nature of just the character relationships, we have to see Ozai. So I totally get what you guys are saying, and I agree with you guys. I'm just thinking like, does that so because of that, it diminishes his role as a villain in your guys' eyes? Is that what you guys are saying? Like it sort of doesn't make him as good of a villain.
Okay, yeah. Well, again, because I'm always looking at things from different contexts. So like for the context in terms of, for me, as like when it comes to like when we're comparing to villains like Joker or even Amon, yes, that kind of does diminishes his value as a villain.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the primary things is that he doesn't have a motive, really. Like,
Yeah.
what's his motive? Just to gain power, essentially, and be the supreme ruler of everything, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's a very basic villain motive.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's the thing where it's like in the first Avengers movie, we don't know sorry, I don't know if the first Avengers movie is the best example to use, but like in the Avengers series, Thanos is the big bad guy for most of the series, who's like behind the
curtain.
the curtain, who like he's this villain that we don't see, and we don't know his motives for the most of it, until it's the end, and like we have to deal with him, and like this is the time. Now we see his motives, and now he becomes this person who is fleshed out as a villain. But then with it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where I feel like with Ozai, they revealed him too soon, but they didn't like address his motives. They didn't flesh him out to be more than just a one-dimensional character. Again, like the whole one-dimensional thing, it works when the villain is this mystery. If in the Lord of the Rings, where Sauron is literally just this evil eyeball that you don't know, nobody ever like knows who he is, or like knows what exactly he's doing, but he's just this mysterious thing, and they just know that he wants to take over the world. And it works because it's like far off and mysterious, and nobody sees him. But as soon as you bring it close, you kind of have to like deal with it as like at that moment, or the one-dimensional aspect of the character will drag throughout the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but for this story in particular, it didn't seem to matter. At least for me, it didn't, because Ozai was never actually. I mean, obviously he was the end goal. Like we got to take down the Fire Lord to stop the war, but characters like Zuko and Azula and pretty much everyone else basically carried the slack for having a villain that's pretty one-dimensional. He was basically the force that was driving all the story and all the character relationships and whatnot. And that was good enough. I mean, this is not what we're talking about. This doesn't relate to whether or not it makes Ozai a good villain or not, but I'm just basically saying it didn't seem to matter that he's a one-dimensional villain for the whole story to work. So in terms of functionality, he serves his purpose, is what I'm trying to say. But in terms of being fleshed out, and at least having that one sentence motive, like Sozin did, where he was like, I want the world to experience like how prosperous the Fire Nation is, because he was talking to Roku in the flashbacks. Like that was the main reason he started the war. He wanted the prosperity to spread and whatnot. And like in his mind, he probably believed that. At least that's like that one sentence motive, But for Ozai, it's just, I just want to be the supreme ruler of everything.
Yeah.
So that's what makes him not so good of a villain in terms of being fleshed out,
I kind of find that funny that they have a villain that we only get to see one episode, and he's more fleshed out than the main villain of the whole series. Like, how does that work?
But again, it works if it's a mysterious villain who's in the background. But as soon as these are my thoughts, and I might be wrong, but for me, I think that it works as long as you keep him in the background. Yeah. The moment that you bring him out and we see him and the mystery is kind of removed, then you have to flesh him out. Otherwise, then it's like, oh, what's the point?
Yeah, they could have fixed it by just giving him one episode, or at least giving an episode that was more centered around what happened in his life.
Yeah.
Sort of essentially Amon and yeah, you remember that Amon episode?
Yes.
Yeah, Noah Talk and his brother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, bad thing. I definitely think that what also could have helped is like maybe there was a twist. Like we thought this person was Ozai, but we realized someone else was Ozai, and maybe that was revealed somewhere along the lines where like the type where Zuko goes and faces his father, and you're like, wait a minute, this guy's not. Who is and then you're like, what? I mean, I feel like that would have been a little
crazy.
more interesting or something like that, or like there was something like because again, back to the whole like you said about the one-dimensional villain, where it's supposed to be like we didn't know about inside Star Wars, we didn't know about
the Emperor. Yeah.
We just know there was Darth Vader, and then we were like, oh, so there's someone taking over Darth Vader.
Yeah.
So if they did something like that, that probably could have helped a lot more for the one-dimensional note. So
Yeah. I feel like they just needed to dedicate one episode to his background, and then we would have had a more fleshed out villain, and that would have made him more rounded, and then we could have like seen it from both sides. But
yeah, definitely.
But it wasn't necessary to make the show my favorite show of all time for animated shows. But yeah. So I guess our conclusion is, oh, well, he's not that great of a villain in terms of being fleshed out, right?
Right.
But in terms of functionality, he worked for the show.
He works.
Yeah.